Hello and welcome back to Simple Time Studios, where I share adventures and solo roleplay for your entertainment. Today we are continuing our solo campaign with the RPG Astroprisma by Crescent Chimera. Enjoy part 2 of Titanium Joe's adventures. Okay, Joe spends 2 fuel going diagonally from Hex 1 to Hex 4 to try and see if he can find that pilot and have another go at taking them down. He probably won't, but it will allow me to fill the hex and maybe find something more helpful. He has 18 fuel left, and after checking the rules, I'm going to roll on the hostile encounter table again, and I get another one. Nothing happens, and I can explore the hex again the next time I come around. With a fresh tank of fuel and a newly repaired ship, Joe arrived in the sector and started aggressively scanning. Nothing. Not a trace was left of the battle or the Reno mercenary he fought with. Shaking his head, he headed northwest to hex grid marker 15 in the middle ring. It was as good of a place to start looking as any, and he couldn't dawdle, not with that mercenary still on the prowl. Okay, going to spend another fuel to go to Hex 15 to bring me down to 17. My first foray into the middle ring. I roll a 2 for a neutral encounter, 6 for a supernatural event, and 5 on the supernatural event table. At first it appeared that the hex was empty like before, but a second later the Crimson Rose's sensors recorded a massive energy spike as a Technicolor light began to come into view. A massive pink prism appeared above his ship as Joe looked at it from the bridge's viewport. The Crimson Rose drifted closer as curiosity gradually got the better of Joe. The giant crystal prism soon filled his entire viewport. "Come out, Doug. Come out." A soft female voice whispered in his mind. Joe looked around. There was only one female that would call him Doug and speak like that, but that was impossible. "Come on, Doug. Come out. Get your suit. You know it's cold out," the voice continued. Try as he might, Joe couldn't resist the pull of the familiar voice. He brought the ship to a stop and put his EVA suit on. A moment later he was outside the ship, tethered to the hull as he drifted up and closer to the giant crystal. Completely enraptured by the voice calling to him, Joe drifted closer and closer as the light became blinding as he reached towards the massive pink crystal. A jolt of energy surged through his body as his vision went black and his life began to flash before his eyes. So many mistakes, so many regrets, and no way to make any of them right. The female voice called again. "You always did worry too much. Don't worry. I'm sure you'll be quicker this time." As the light faded, Joe found himself back in the pilot's chair on his ship. His helmet was off, but the rest of his EVA suit was still on. As he came back to his senses, he sat up and looked for the crystal prism. But the prism and the strange light it emitted were both gone. Okay, bumped Joe's grace from 3 to 4 due to the crystal giving me a +1 to any of his 4 stats. With nothing else in the hex of note, Joe coaxed the engines back to life and flew north to the next grid marker. Joe flies to hex 16, bringing his fuel down to 16, rolling for the new hex. I get a 4, which is a middle ring event. Rolled odds and rolled a 4, so I get event 4 on the Star Cruiser table. Arriving in the hex, Joe looked at the Crimson Rose's scanners and saw a ping for another abandoned ship adrift in space. With the hope of lucrative salvage on his mind, Joe flew towards the derelict ship. He soon found himself docking with an abandoned cyber laboratory ship. With a small flashlight mounted to the underside of his laser blaster, he boarded the ship and started to search the darkness for anything he could sell. Searching through the darkness, pistol raised, Joe was surprised when he heard a female voice call out, "Please don't shoot!" Joe turned with his weapon raised and found himself looking at a slender, mousy-looking woman dressed in a worn jumpsuit with a studious look in her eyes. Joe lowered his blaster ever so slightly. "Who are you and what are you doing here?" "I'm Ursula. I was a programmer here. We were ambushed by pirates. I managed to hide by locking myself in a locked container. Can you get me into a settlement?" she introduced, answering his questions rapid fire. Joe lowered his pistol the rest of the way down. "I'm Joe. I came here looking for anything I could sell back at Civilization." "All right, I guess I can help you. Looks like the pirates stripped everything of value already anyway," he grumbled and led Ursula back to his ship. "So, do you know of any other settlements in this system?" he asked her as they finished boarding and getting settled into the Crimson Rose. "I only know of one in the Inner Ring, Ursa Scarab, Synth Arch Settlement. You hear about it before?" he asked, as much to start a conversation as to get the location of any additional settlements so he didn't have to keep running to the Synth Arch. "Does Ursula know the location of any other settlements? I'm going to ask the Oracle." And I get it too. No, she doesn't. Ursula made a face at the mention of the Synth Arch, but shook her head. "No, someone else always piloted the ship. I just went where the ship took me," she shrugged apologetically. Joe shook his head in turn and took off into the next sector. If he didn't find a closer settlement, he supposed he could drop her off at the Synth Arch settlement, although he had a strange suspicion that might not go over too well. Okay, Joe heads northeast towards Hex 17. He spends another fuel, bringing him down to 15. 2, he gets a neutral encounter. 3, I roll a 3, so it's a cargo transport. 5, I board an abandoned Shell 4 transport and get a disruptor beams ship module. Arriving at the new Hex sector, Joe went through the motions of scanning the area to find anything of interest. Almost immediately, he picks up the ping of another derelict ship idly drifting through space, a big one. As the ship finally came into view, Joe's eyes went wide. It was a Shell 4, one of the biggest cargo liners in service. The navigation lights flickered uncontrollably as Joe went aboard to search the ship for survivors or anything he could sell back at a friendly port. Stepping into the main crew areas, he found the crew dead on the floor and the cargo bay stripped of anything worth a credit. As he stepped over and examined a corpse on the bridge, he found evidence of several gunshots and a deep gash running the length of the pilot's lower torso. There was only one group that would do this to independent traders. "Pirates," Joe muttered with a scowl. Examining the bridge further, he found that one of the ship's weapon modules, a pair of twin-linked disruptor beams, were undamaged and knocked loose in the fight with the unknown pirates. With a little elbow grease, he could get them detached and back onto the Crimson Rose. Maybe he could install them on his ship. Maybe he could sell them if he was in the right settlement. Once the ship module was loaded into Crimson Rose's cargo bay, he fired up the Rose's engines and took off for the next hex. Hex 18. Joe is down to 14 fuel. I get 3 for a faction encounter. 1, it's the Corsair faction encounter. I have neutral favor and rolled a 5, so it's a bounty hunter Sirio Hex. He offers Joe a job and tries to get him to agree before hearing the details. Joe politely but very firmly refuses until Sirio gives up some of the details. The Corsair Syndicate wants Joe to gun down a warg major general holed up on a crater moon somewhere. Joe begrudgingly accepts the contract before moving on to Hex 7 to the southeast. When he first arrived, Joe thought the grid location was an empty stretch of space. Flying for a bit before his engines were ready for the next jump, Titanium Joe soon picked up the sensor profile of a Star Predator model fighter on a course to intercept him. As the small fighter came into view, Joe could make out the distinct markings, a golden dragon figurehead, and a hull with a red and black reflective paint job. Joe had heard of this individual but had never expected to meet him. Sirio Hex, a legendary bounty hunter that worked for the Corsair Syndicate. This could be either very good or very bad, depending on how the next few moments played out. Joe Henderson, the Syndicate has been following your tracks. I've got a job for you, Sirio broadcasted over the Crimson Rose's radio speakers, his gravelly voice doing nothing to soothe Joe's nerves. What tracks? I've barely been in the system for a week, and I've been avoiding making trouble so far. The Syndicate likes to keep track of things, especially when it concerns defecting members of our crime family that's been trying to establish a foothold in this system, Sirio replied, sending chills down Joe's spine. You said something about having a job for me? The lone gunslinger asked, changing the subject. A good job, too. It was a standard bounty, but there's a bonus. And the local Syndicate bosses are watching this one, too. Might be a good way to get in with us. We can certainly make good use of a former Reno family triggerman, Sirio Hex answered. It was an attempt to flatter him into agreeing before hearing the job out in full. If you know so much about my former employer, then you should know that we don't agree to anything until we hear the details, Joe replied firmly. Hex sighed as if he was tired of the game. There's a Warg general hiding out in a base on a crater moon somewhere in the system. Client wants him removed. Violently. Are you interested? Yeah, I'll see what I can do, Joe replied, in agreement before flying off. He needed to find a settlement soon. Okay, Hex 7. Joe has 13 fuel left. I roll a 3 for another faction encounter. I roll an 8 for an ISF encounter. I roll a 2 so I can dock with an ISF heavy freighter running supplies to a distant colony and trade weapons, armor, or weapon mods with them. Given how Joe is still broke, he's going to pass on that for now and move on to Hex 8. Upon arriving in the grid Hex, Joe was immediately pinged by an ISF heavy freighter running supplies between the inner ring and a distant colony. A merchant on board the ship radioed and offered to sell personal weapons, weapon mods, and armor sets. Joe considered it and shook his head. Sorry, not this time, but where's the colony you're headed to? He asked, trying to get some more information about the system. Can the trader give information about the location of another settlement? Let's ask the Oracle. I get a 4, which is a yes, but... Sorry, friend, Captain doesn't want me talking about that to just anybody. Talk to us again when you have someone in the ISF to vouch for you, he replied politely before the freighter jumped off into the unknown. Joe shook his head and continued on his way as well. There had to be something closer than Ursula's Scarab, but it was quickly looking like that might not be the case. Okay, Hex 8. Joe has 12 fuel left. I roll a 1 and have a hostile encounter on the middle ring. I roll a 1 again, which means I don't encounter anything, and this hex remains blank for the time being. I move down to Hex 9. Arriving in the new grid Hex, Joe started scanning, and the Crimson Rose's sensors reported back with a venerable cornucopia of nothing. Nothing of note was in sensor range, so he looked back at Ursula. I know you're not a fan of the bot heads. I'm not sure I blame you, but we are running out of grids before it makes more sense to head back to Ursula's Scarab. Ursula made a face. Alright, let's try one more grid Hex, then we turn back. Joe nodded and took off again. At least he was filling up the system map little by little. Hex 9. Joe has 11 fuel left. I roll a 4, which means I get a middle ring event. I roll odds again. And I roll a 4 on that table. I already have that quest event, so I reroll again. I roll 1, which means I get the ISF Terraformer Starship event and the location of a Gaian planet in Hex 10. He's not going to head there right away. Instead, he's going to go back to Ursula's Scarab to refuel and drop off Ursula. Ursula probably won't be happy. It's a synth arch settlement. Ironic that they're still the only faction I've found so far. but she will probably know how to get home from there, or cause acts of sabotage in the name of her faction. Either is good at this point. What Joe and Ursula found at the next hex grid was not an orbital colony, but given the sheer size of the vessel, it almost looked like one at first. Even as the Crimson Rose displayed the sensor profile on the screen in front of them, Joe still couldn't believe it. A terraformer ship? I thought those were all destroyed in the cataclysm. Never thought I'd actually see one, he mused aloud as he looked at the sensor report. The ISF has restored a few of them to try and terraform barren worlds, Ursula replied. Looks abandoned, whatever it is. If it's a terraforming ship, then there might be some navigation data on the computers, he replied as he docked the Crimson Rose with the drifting terraformer. Searching the wrecked ship as much as he could, Joe only found one thing of note. A colossal weeping willow growing wild in the greenhouse sector. In the same room was a hermetically sealed container of genetically altered seeds and a computer terminal containing data on the ship's terraforming mission. Most of the data was too corrupted for Joe to use, but there was a location of a nearby Gaian planet that was supposed to be replanted. Joe uploaded the data to his ship and left with the seed container tucked under his arm. There wasn't a place he could think of where he could unload the seeds, but finishing the mission might go over well with the ISF. And so far they were looking like the group Joe liked the most. Or at least hated the least. Boarding the Crimson Rose and casting off from the terraformer, Joe entered the coordinates for Ursula's Scarab. End of chapter.